I'd like to welcome you to our plenary this morning on employment and improving recidivism outcomes. I want to start by introducing our panelists, tell you a little bit about who I am, offer some framing remarks, and get right into the conversation, okay? My name is John Padilla. I am with the Annie Casey Foundation. Does this sound right, or is this an echo?
It's very echoey.
Very echoey? Okay, so maybe I'm too close. My name is John Padilla. I'm with the Annie Casey Foundation. I manage the foundation's national portfolios around employment and reentry. I also lead the foundation's work in Connecticut. I want to tell you a little bit about how the foundation comes to the work prior to introducing our panelists. For those of you who don't know anything about Casey, we are probably one of the largest philanthropies in the country, specifically dedicated to improving outcomes for the more vulnerable populations, specifically children and families. We come out of the UPS world. Annie E. Casey was the mother of Jim Casey, who founded UPS. So we originally come out of that world. So if you know anything about UPS, that explains why we as a foundation are so data-driven. In terms of industrial engineering, UPS are the masters. We look at reentry in terms of children and families. So Casey is not a large funder of reentry services, but our work really is focused on the fact that there are some 7 million children who have an incarcerated parent or loved one. Those parents' loved ones get out. We want to ensure that there are opportunities for them to pick up the pieces and reunite successfully with their families and re-enter their communities. So our work really focuses on child outcomes, around reducing employment barriers, and trying to address policies that get in the way of people being able to start over, okay? Let me say a quick word about our panelists, and I'm going to start to my left here. First, we have Leanne Duran. Leanne is the director of the Council of State Government
Corrections program.
Thank you. Corrections program. I'm blanking here for a minute. She comes to the, prior to coming there, she comes from the state of Michigan, where she has extensive experience in the corrections system. To her left, we have Cindy Redcross from MDRC. Cindy is a senior associate and researcher focusing in the health and barriers to employment policy arenas. Cindy is also one of the lead researchers in MDRC's employment evaluation area. To her left, we have Ms. Mindy Tarlow, CEO of the Center for Employment Opportunities. Mindy's one of the champions in this field, really has done a lot of great work over many years to create employment opportunities and just overall opportunities for men and women who are coming back from prison. Moving right along, we have Steve McCullough. Steve is the Chief Operating Officer of the SAFER Foundation in Chicago. Steve has been actually at SAFER for a little over a year, comes back home from Chicago from previous work in California and in other areas, also as a former Casey National Fellow. Thank you, Steve. And then lastly, we have Hank Rosen, Program Associate at the Justice Center, and one of the people who has been very instrumental in pulling together not only our panel, but a lot of the content area that we will talk about today. So these are our panelists. By way of some framing remarks, let me talk about some just quick observations that I've seen in this field, both as a funder and as a practitioner. As I said a minute ago, we come to this work because of our interest in better outcomes for children and families. And yesterday you heard, and even today, this morning, it continues, lots of emphasis on the importance of employment, of having a job, of connecting former offenders, formerly incarcerated persons to employment. And you also heard the word redemption used a number of times. We believe people should get a second chance. And as we look at, as a funder and both a practitioner, we look at the field, we see lots of people doing different kinds of services, different kinds of approaches to working with offenders, and we see a real strong need to distribute and share what we know works with these various populations. We understand that not a single approach works. We understand that even for your regular, quote unquote, regular employment work, people take different strategies for different populations. And that need becomes, and that understanding becomes even more acute when we're talking about former offenders. We know that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence around employment and reincarceration. What we don't know precisely is, what are the nuances? As someone said earlier, 89% of folks who are reincarcerated at the time are not employed. So again, anecdotally, we know that if someone is working, there's a higher probability that they will not be reincarcerated, but that is not a finite point. One of the things that we want to talk about today is emerging research that has been in part funded by Casey, but that has been led by the Justice Center, about what exactly is the right mix, or what are we knowing more about what are the right mix of services and supports that can really guarantee or improve the chances of successful reentry, of sustained employment, and of just a lifetime of staying out of prison and, again, resuming a healthy family and community life. I think I'm going to stop there and turn this over to Leanne so we can get started more on the panel and also hopefully have an opportunity for folks to ask questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Good morning. As John mentioned, we've been hearing a lot about the importance of jobs and employment over the last 2 days as a critical factor of reentry. But we know that the research on the role of jobs in improving outcomes, in reducing recidivism, is complicated. And we've asked our panel here to come together and explore the elements of the research, help us understand what we're learning, and talk us through some of the implications for practice. So as John mentioned, we have our sort of research hat here in Cindy Redcross, and then we have two expert practitioners from two really incredible employment programs, CEO and Safer Foundation, to help talk us through the implications for policy and practice. So with that, I wanted to open the question and turn it over to you, Cindy, and ask you to tell us, what are we learning from the emerging research, and what is that telling us about the relationship between jobs and reducing recidivism?
Okay, sure. Thank you, Leanne. Okay, so just broadly speaking, we find that the evaluation evidence on the effectiveness of the effective employment programs on recidivism is mixed. Right, so that means that we see a correlation. We see that people who are employed are sort of less likely to recidivate, but causality isn't clear. So we don't know for sure whether it's employment per se that's causing the reduction in recidivism, or just that people who are more likely to work are also less likely to recidivate. All of that being said, there's theoretical arguments and empirical evidence to support the notion that crime is linked to high unemployment, low earnings, and job instability. Qualitative data suggests that finding a job is the highest priority cited by parole officers and prisoners after they are released. So even though the findings I'm about to present today are a little unclear, and nuanced, the point still remains that employment programs are going to be instrumental in impacting recidivism, particularly because no matter what the findings say, they remain a central component of most state reentry efforts. So this puts employment programs in a good position to impact recidivism. So in recent years, we have findings emerging from two large-scale evaluations of transitional jobs programs for former prisoners. And these evaluations have provided some guidance on how employment programs can be most effective. In total, 5 programs have been rigorously evaluated by MDRC. The Center for Employment Opportunities in New York City is one of the programs. 4 others in the Midwest, including the SAFER Foundation, have undergone random assignment evaluation research. This is considered the gold standard, and when we do this kind of study, it means that we can actually determine causality, so there isn't this issue of correlation. So we know the impacts that emerge from a random assignment study that's fact. Those are the results. So transitional, these programs all provided transitional jobs to people being released from prison. Now, transitional jobs place participants in immediate wage-paying temporary jobs. While they're working on these jobs, they have they gain work experience, and it also gives staff the opportunity to work with clients to address the soft skills and other performance issues that might prevent them from succeeding in the labor market. So that's the model. And the theory behind this model is that, first of all, you immediately raise people's earnings just by giving them a job. So you increase their income, and if they're working, they're busy, so they may be less likely to commit crimes. And further, if these types of jobs improve people's skills and experience, we could see longer-term gains in employment. So the 5 programs that we studied in recent years all provided transitional jobs to participants. The structure of the models differed. CEO uses a work crew model. So that means participants work in small crews with 6 to 8 people being supervised by a CEO staff person whose job it is to provide oversight as well as job coaching to the small number of participants. So they spend 8 hours a day on a crew with someone who's coaching them while they're working. The other programs, there was a program in Detroit and St. Paul that were operated by Goodwill, and participants worked in Goodwill enterprises. The SAFER Foundation participants were employed in garbage recycling plants, and the New Hope program in Milwaukee placed participants in positions with local nonprofit organizations and small businesses where their wages were paid by New Hope. So you can see we have a range of models that we evaluated across these 5 programs. And what we observed in all of them is very high rates of participation. So that means basically the takeaway from that is if you give a former prisoner a job, they're willing to work because almost all of them showed up and participated in the program, worked 8 hours a day. So that's an important finding in and of itself, that they do want to work. So all of the studies tested impacts on employment and recidivism objectively. So we used administrative records. That means we collected data from the state UI agencies and the state criminal justice agencies for both the program and the control group. So there is no bias in the data. We're getting the same data for both research groups. Now what we found was that all programs generated pretty large increases in employment during the first year mostly while participants were engaged in employment. In the transitional employment. Largely, those large employment impacts were generated by the transitional jobs themselves. So as people started to transition out of these temporary jobs, we started to see the sort of 2 research groups come together in terms of their levels of employment. Now, what was interesting is that we saw these huge impacts on employment during the first year, but only 1 of the 5 programs had impacts on recidivism at the same time. So that means just because people were working, it didn't necessarily mean that they were going to stop committing crimes, except in this one program, which was the Center for Employment Opportunities in New York City. So while these findings are somewhat disappointing, I think we just started to dig deeper, and we're like, well, wait a second. We know that one of these programs did generate large impacts on employment, which is very difficult to do in a rigorous evaluation. So we just started to think about, okay, so what was it that was different about CEO's model? And at the same time, so we're trying to figure out what's going on. We have this one program that generated large impacts, so what's going on? At the same time, we start hearing about targeting and looking at people's risk factors and what kind of people are most likely to benefit from these kinds of programs. We're also hearing from criminologists arguing that in order to reduce recidivism, you first have to change attitudes and thinking patterns, that it's not necessarily about the job or the economic circumstances, but it's about the way that people think. So we're hearing all of this, and what we came up with, just to summarize quickly, is that the first hypothesis is that CEO's program is the only one that operated the work crew model. So one hypothesis is that this structure was somehow influential in changing participants' values and beliefs and the way that they think. Remember, the crews are led by individuals who play sort of a modeling role for participants. It's someone that the participants can relate to. They're also involved with peers and getting peer influences in a positive environment. So this kind of structure may have led to changes in the way that people's outlooks and led them to stay away from crime. Just seeing things in a different way. So that's one hypothesis. We also started digging around to see, well, who maybe there's certain subgroups that benefited more from CEO's type of program. And we saw a very clear pattern emerging when we started to look at these findings by the various subgroups. We saw that CEO's impacts on recidivism were largest for people who were at highest risk of recidivism when they enrolled in the program. So we created this risk index based on, we had a bunch of criminal history data, a lot of demographics. We created an index at the time of random assignment, so we knew where people fell on this category. And it was, there's a paper on MDRC's website describing how the different results emerged, and that people at highest risk were most likely to benefit from the program. And in fact, people at low risk, there's some evidence that you can actually increase recidivism. It can go the other way. So that's something very important to pay attention to, and you'll hear more about that later. We also saw a similar pattern emerging among other kinds of disadvantaged subgroups. So we looked at people with no high school diploma or GED. The impacts were larger in that subgroup as well. So it's like all of these subgroups we're seeing the impacts are really being driven by this group of the most disadvantaged people. So more, higher number of prior convictions at baseline, no high school diploma, highest risk. So all the people that are most difficult to work with in your programs, those are the people that benefit most. So that's a good way to look at it. The guy who's sitting in the corner that really you don't want to be bothered with, that's probably the one that's going to benefit the most from your program and start to appreciate it later. So let's see. So we can't be certain. We can't be certain what caused CEO's impacts, but we feel like, the culmination of the evidence that we're seeing and what the field is observing, we feel like it's all coming together, and we have some broad lessons that we feel can be applied to any type of program. It doesn't have to be a transitional jobs program. It can be any kind of employment program. First, targeting is very important, as I mentioned. You have to know your population. Know who your program is going to work better for. Try to identify the people at the highest risk, most disadvantaged. As I said, probably the people who aren't asking for your help. That they're there and they're sort of have a little bit of an attitude, but it's probably them. It's also important when you provide services that you have to engage people shortly after release from prison. You have to try to get them early on before they go back into their old patterns of behaviors and attitudes. And also important to remember that, employment may not guarantee reductions in recidivism, but it may be the only way you get people to show up, pay them incentives or, offer them a job, do something to get them to show up so that you can provide the other kind of services that will impact recidivism. So employment is a tool for engagement as well. And employment programs should also consider including components in their models that address criminal thinking and behaviors. It doesn't have to be a work crew model, right? It can just be a peer support group or some kind of mentoring, there's cognitive behavioral curriculums, just different things that you can work on their cognitive behavioral thinking, at the same time as they're engaged in your program. And finally, I mentioned incentives. So, we've seen over and over again that financial incentives is another way to engage people, both to show up to the program as well as to hold on to jobs. Pay them a little bonus for every month that they maintain their job. And we've seen that be effective actually in rigorous research across populations. It's one consistent thing that MDRC has found. So that's all. I'll stop now and give other people time to talk.
Thank you, Cindy.
Sure.
So just to be clear, what we heard from the research that MDRC has done, and I just wanted to preface the research that has come out of MDRC by saying, you're not a criminologist, right? You don't study patterns of criminal desistance and all of those things. You are evaluating employment programs, and your expertise is in evaluating those employment programs. So to have a person whose experience is employment evaluation finding the same risk reduction principles that the field of criminology has been talking about is really, I think, quite a great overlap. But just to be clear, what we're hearing is that jobs alone don't reduce recidivism.
That's right.
Simply getting a person a job is not enough to have that added benefit of reducing their risk and reducing our overall recidivism rates.
That's right. I mean, we'll talk a little bit more. There's a breakout session later. How when MDRC went into this evaluation, we thought the pattern was going to be you get them a job, and then subsequently you'll see reductions in recidivism. And we just learned so much, along the way, and it might be interesting to hear our story about how this unfolded. But we learned that pretty early on, and it was pretty surprising to find that jobs actually don't. Just giving someone a job doesn't mean that they're going to stay out of prison and stop committing crime. So.
And then I also heard you say that, particularly in a time of limited resources, that it's important that we target the people who will benefit most from our programs and services, which is a message that in the reentry community we talk about and hear a lot about and have explored extensively. Mm-hmm. But through your research, what we're finding is that the same people who will benefit most from employment services are the same people who benefit most from our reentry services and interventions, which are the people most likely to reoffend.
That's right.
So the higher risk individuals are who we need to target for our employment services.
I think that's right. That's right. Our evidence, the evidence coming out of these studies was very clear. And as I said, you should visit MDRC's website, and you'll start to see. And I can talk to you later. That the pattern is very clear. That it's the highest risk, the most disadvantaged, no high school GED, a lot of prior convictions. So those are the people, and the pattern is very clear across all of those subgroups.
So with that, Mindy, I wanted to ask you a question, which is, we are hearing, and have heard extensively about targeting higher risk populations. And I just wanted you to help us understand how CEO targets this group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first I just want to say that this is a learning community, and you're sort of seeing it right up here in front of you. We, people like Leanne and people like Cindy and organizations like CSG and MDRC have really helped organizations like CEO and SAFER and all of us in the direct service field really learn more about what we're doing and what's working better than what, and I think this community is making a really big impact. So I just wanted to say that and to thank you guys publicly for really helping us do a better job for a lot more people. So the way we sort of look at it at CEO, and the research has not only underscored this, but also helped us learn more about this, is that what we're really trying to do is get the right person into the right program at the right time. And those three things are critically important and interlinked. So starting with the right person, we learned that, so many times when you're a program like ours, your instinct is to take the person you think is most likely to succeed. I think it's sort of just a, sort of a common thing in the provider community, when in fact, in our community, the person who's least likely to succeed is the one you're going to have the most impact on. And there's a difference between outcomes and impact. Outcomes, somebody could get a job with or without me, and I get to count it as a job. That's an outcome, but what did it really mean? What did I really do? That's how I interpret the word causality. What did I do that made that person have a better outcome? And what that means is, what impact did I have? So we're not saying that high-risk people get more jobs than low-risk people. We're simply saying that high-risk people that get our services are getting more jobs than high-risk people that don't get our services. And the difference between the two is the impact that we're having. So once you're armed with that, what you really need to do is communicate with your criminal justice partner and say, you know, that person that you're really worried about, that person who you're thinking, maybe I shouldn't refer this person to any program because I'm really concerned they're not going to succeed, they're not going to show up. That's the person I want. So part of how we get the clients that we're looking for is by working with our criminal justice partners around educating each other about who the population is, who we think is going to do best in our program. So that's the right person part. And I also want to add, in terms of risk indicators, the thing that we feel is the most critical for us is the age of the person, that not only are young people at higher risk of reoffending, but just by virtue of the fact that they're young, they have a whole life in front of them where they're going to make a whole lot more choices than somebody who's 50, 60, or older. So focusing on young adults, I think, is really important for us, and that's something that's very kind of concrete and doesn't require the same kind of evaluation, risk instruments, et cetera. You know, you're really just looking at what is the age of this person, and if this person is young and based on your criminogenic score at higher risk of reoffending, they should come to CEO. So the way we get folks is really a two-way street. We go to our criminal justice partners come to us, and we try to educate each other around the criteria for people who would work best for CEO. Now, that may not be the same in other programs, but it is for CEO. And that gets me to my next point. So now you've got the right person. What's the right program for that person at the right time? So the right time, I think we can all agree, is as close to release as possible. The reentry period is among the most fragile and vulnerable periods in that individual's life. And so there's a threat involved that if someone doesn't get the opportunity, and Secretary Solis kept talking about giving people opportunity, if that person doesn't get the opportunity at the right time, there's a risk, a higher risk than further down the road that they may engage in future criminal behavior. But there's also an opportunity. With every threat comes opportunity, and the opportunity is the moment to engage that person and turn their lives around. We see people, we have a retention dinner tomorrow evening, which is going to be a room that's filled with people who worked as little as 30 days and as high as 3 years. And each person gets an award, and each person gets to come up and say something. So this is our form of research. To a person, they will say, I came to CEO at the lowest point in my life. I wanted to make a change. I wanted to do right by my kids. I wanted to turn my life around, and nobody would help me. I came to CEO, they gave me this opportunity, I took advantage of it, and here I stand. So I think with every threat of reoffense comes the opportunity to engage that person who's highly motivated to do the right thing, highly motivated not to go back to prison. So that's getting the right person, and it's getting them at the right time. And now let's talk about the right program for that individual. What we know is people want to and need to work immediately, and it's probably the hardest time for them to engage in employment. So we're trying to engage people as quickly as possible, and I think Cindy said it right, that if nothing else, you're engaging somebody with something that they want, and it gives you an opportunity to also give them something that they need, which is the support and the skills and the guidance to engage in the workforce effectively. And I do think that that's sort of an essential coming together of what we know, that work does work, but it can't be in a vacuum. It has to be surrounded by the kind of behavioral skill building, by the kind of cognitive shift that happens when somebody really changes their behavior. We believe that just like you can't have a work program in a vacuum, you can't have skill building in a vacuum, that they go together, that most people learn by doing. Most adults, however young they may be, these individuals are leading very adult lives, and in order to engage them in shifting their thinking, we find the best engagement strategy is a doing strategy, and that doing is work. So we're using work as that central core value around which to establish what we hope are lifelong shifts in behavior that keep people from going down that criminal path. I also think another thing that's critical is understanding that individual's need for income. When people come home, one of the things I feel strongly about in terms of programming is understanding how that person is going to access immediate income. And if there is no access to immediate income, you have to determine what their income needs are, and you have to try to fill that gap, which I think immediate transitional employment programs attempt to do. So you're helping to build skills at the right time, in the right way, with the peer support and role models that skill-building environment requires, and you're providing access to immediate income during this very fragile period. And I think taken together, those things really work. And in fact, when you look at the CEO evaluation in broad strokes, you do see that the employment impact, while it's quite large, it fades over time, and the recidivism impact continues. So we believe that's a behavioral shift that's occurring. However, if you do break down the evaluation into the very risk categories we've been discussing, higher risk of reoffending, being 29 years old or younger, not having a high school diploma or a GED, not only do you find that the recidivism impacts are high and remain that way over the 3-year period, but so are the employment impacts. 3 years later, people who were in the higher risk category were in fact statistically significantly more likely to be employed than their counterparts. So I think that's a very important thing to know as we go forward in terms of who are we focusing these programs on, what do they look like, and when do they occur.
Right. And so are these findings having any influence on state policy in New York?
Well, actually, that's a really thrilling thing for me personally. I sometimes feel like I've had this job since I was born, but living in dog years as I do, and it's really only been about 18 years. And I really do think, and again, I really have to credit both CSG and MDRC as partners in this, that we are actually using these results to influence policy on a real level. In New York State right now, Governor Cuomo announced what's called the Work for Success Initiative in February, which is designed to help formerly incarcerated people get more employment opportunities. That effort, which involves a whole range of government, nonprofit, and outside experts, is focusing specifically on this very issue, which we're referring to as client matching. How do you determine how you get the right person to the right program at the right time? And Leanne is very engaged in that effort with us as well. And it's really starting to come together. And that's taking all the hard work that we've done and all the research that we've exposed ourselves to and everything that we've learned, because it is a learning experience and a powerful one, I think is starting to transform how the state of New York thinks about how they refer people coming home from prison to employment programs, because it's not just employment as some panacea. It's what does the program look like, what are the components of it, what are the needs of this individual, and how do you match one to the other. And we're very excited about that work and look forward to sharing our pilot project outcomes with you all, hopefully next year at this time.
Right. So just as you did such a great recap, we've talked about it's the right person, and that person is at higher risk of reoffending, is the key target population, and it's the right program provided at the right time. And so I wanted to just cap for you some of the key elements of that program that both Mindy and Cindy have mentioned. Immediate connection to a job, to immediate access to income. Things like pay each day as a concrete incentive for continuing to show up in the employment program for the employment services to get the benefits. Things like positive role models, which CEO uses through a work crew or in a crew chief model, surrounding people who are reinforcing that change process and continuing again to change thinking and increase motivation. So all of those sound to me, coming from a corrections background, like the risk-need responsivity principles. Locked up.
That's really catchy, Leanne. Maybe we can do an ad about that.
Yes. For those vocabulary words that we hear, in so much of the research around reentry and criminal justice interventions, we call it R&R. And I was just wondering if, Hank, if you could just quickly remind us of the definitions of those three principles that come from the corrections literature.
I'd love to. Funny how that works out.
You just have to have them right here.
What do you know? So I think, pulling from Leanne, I think she's right. It sounds a lot like risk-need responsivity, which is sort of a foundation or a guiding principle that many of us adhere to or attempt to adhere to in the corrections, criminal justice, and reentry world. And sort of as a brief overview, when we talk about risk and the risk principle, we're essentially saying that we want to match the intensity of the services or the program to the risk of recidivism or reoffending. So what that leads us to do is take an approach like Mindy, which is prioritizing services and higher intensive services for those folks who are at greater risk of reoffending. And we sort of determine those risk levels by using validated risk assessment tools. These risk levels aren't based on, institutional risk or poor behavior or necessarily crime of conviction, but a myriad of other factors that contribute to your risk of reoffending upon returning to the community. Sort of the next part of that principle is the needs principle. And what this principle tells us is it helps us identify which needs are likely linked to recidivism or the criminal behavior. And so what we should do here is the needs principle helps us identify those services that are likely to have an impact on someone in the community. So while it's employment or housing or some of these other things that everyone needs after they're returning from a stay of incarceration, really the things that make a difference are those that attend to antisocial thinking styles and personality, antisocial behaviors, and of course, antisocial peers and friends. And so services that can engage someone and address those, such as work crews, you're likely to see a change in behavior and sort of promote those positive outcomes that we talk about. So finally, even though we sort of know who to target and how to deliver those services, or what services are most likely to have an impact, the responsivity principle, which can be confusing. I think responsivity is definitely a made-up word, and so probably the definition follows. But it tells us that we need to deliver services in a way that sort of maximize someone's ability to succeed, or structure services such that they meet the person where they are and sort of guide them through the entire program or process. So this can include sort of high levels of engagement. We talk about translating things to meet them according to their education levels. If someone doesn't necessarily have high job skills, put them in a program that attends to that, but also sort of meets their other needs and puts them into contact with folks who are positive role models, and sort of engage them in ways that are meaningful for them, not simply plopping them into a program and expecting sort of the best results.
Thank you, Hank. So, as you can see, we're exploring this intersection between the risk reduction literature, which is built on decades and decades of research, and some of the emerging research into the employment and reentry world, which are finding the same things. And at the end of the summer, the Council of State Governments Justice Center is going to be releasing a publication that tries to explore this issue further and kind of write down some of these moments that seem to be so important for getting reentry services and employment services right. But we all know at the end of the day, with all of the effort that we are putting into our reentry employment services, we really are trying to connect folks to jobs, and we hope that the way that we are connecting them to jobs will have the added benefit of reducing recidivism and reducing risk. But, in order to do kind of step one, which is connecting people to jobs, we have to have good relationships to the employer community. And we know that those conversations are happening with you and your employers in your community all over this country. And wanted to ask Safer Stephen, if you wouldn't mind, to talk a little bit about the way that you have approached the employer community in Chicago and help us understand what you've learned from that experience.
Sure. Good morning. Safer is at a crossroads. I think we're a pure open source, provider of services for people returning from corrections and across the state of Illinois, and mainly we're centered in Chicago, but we're pretty much all over the state. And I think the key driver for us, and the reason why I say we're at a crossroads, is because we're incorporating a lot of the ideas and the concepts that came out of the MDRC study, and incorporating the work proof models and doing all of that good stuff. But at our core is creating job opportunities for individuals. So those individuals could be recently released or been out of corrections for a significant period of time. I think what it comes down to for us is matching, again, kind of echoing what was mentioned before, is matching the right person with the right opportunity at the right time. And it boils down to having an appropriate assessment of skills up front. And that assessment includes a risk assessment, it includes educational assessment, it includes career aptitude and willingness to work. And then taking all of that in the context of, I need a job now, and I need to work fast, and I need to put food on the table, I need to get back on child support. All of those issues come into play. And so where the challenge becomes is, transitional jobs are one facet of the work, but there's also permanent placement. Last year we saw probably about close to 13,000 people, of which we placed about 4,500 into jobs. But those 4,500 jobs, we only had 50% attain 30 days. But then if you get a person to 30 days, then retention jumps exponentially. We get up to 80 to 90%. So really zeroing in on what are the factors that prevent individuals from lasting beyond 30 days is the fundamental question that we're struggling with answering and work toward answering every day. A lot of that has to do with employers, right? So we have a sector approach to working with employers. We know Chicago is pretty robust, and Illinois is pretty robust in terms of the number of sectors that we have opportunities to place clients into. And so the question always is, what are the benefits from an employer perspective? It boils down to three factors. One is an employer need, and a willingness to hire individuals with criminal backgrounds. And another factor is, the company or the employer has either, really believes in the mission of what we're trying to do. That employer has some connection to a person or the correction system that gives themselves open to working with clients with criminal records. And then the other issue is high turnover. Employers have, depending on the employer, they just need to churn jobs, and it just depends on the nature of the job. So, for example, in like third-party logistics, you're talking warehouse transportation distribution, it's a high turnover. Quite a few of our employers are staffing companies themselves. And so working with staffing companies, and they also have high turnover, although we're seeing more and more staffing companies doing more and more permanent placements as well. So when we think about the employer in the sectors that they're in. Obviously you have your, there's traditional hospitality, retail. We have a robust manufacturing environment. We have, again, like I said before, third-party logistics. Then there's your maintenance work. So there's landscaping, janitorial, other different types of jobs that we're able to place individuals into. I echo the comments about work crews, because work crews are, we found, and since the MDRC study, we got off, our work crew model started late in that process, but it's like proliferated. So we're doing more government sector work, using work crew models. So if you go familiar with Chicago, you go down State Street. Our work crews are actually doing the maintenance up and down State Street. We're in the parks. We're in different neighborhoods doing the cleanup, and those are work crew models, and those are really effective. We're currently about to finish up a demonstration that's funded by the MacArthur Foundation in one specific community, doing wraparound services around the reentry population, using a work crew model, and we're really seeing the recidivism rates drop significantly and things like that. All that to say is you have a number of different ways to engage, and what it boils back to is knowing the individual, knowing the client, and that goes back to really doing a good job in assessment, having really good case management, and then post-job placement, really focusing on both the employer side and the client side, what works, what has kept that person in that job, what are the conditions and factors. The last thing I'll say is we also measure success, not only in the initial placement, but also in wage progression and mobility in that job. So once we make the first placement, the question becomes, how do we, move that person up the ladder? And we've been spending a lot of time thinking about both incumbent worker training. So for our highest employers, can we do increased educational attainment within the employer? So working with the employer, designing educational advancement programming within the workplace. So we assess what the career ladder is, and we're working right now with a plastics manufacturer that we place 80 clients a year into. Basically very low level, entry level, high turnover, but there's mobility opportunities. And our average client has a 6th grade reading and math. We know the machine operator, you need between 9th and 12th grade. So we've designed incumbent worker training, so we're taking the workers that we place in the workplace after work hours and doing basic skills. And then we're tracking them and seeing how they move up the ladder. I think that's going to be a critical factor, and especially about retention. When we're talking about this particular population, being able to not only say we placed them in the job, but we moved them up the ladder. Yes. We're building assets. We're helping them reestablish connections in their communities, and we're creating not only stability for that individual, but their families and their community as well. So that's kind of where we're at.
Thank you. And I just wanted to, one of the things that you had mentioned about the kind of dynamic of talking to employers is about their willingness to work with people with criminal histories. And I just wanted to mention that it's come up in several conversations over the last couple of days about the recent clarification that the EEOC put out, providing clearer guidance about their standards for regulating criminal background checks. And if you listened to NPR yesterday, NPR also mentioned the EEOC ruling in a story as well that really explains that only job-relevant convictions should be considered by employers, which I'm really hoping is such a huge statement to make to the employer community.
Absolutely. I mean, our sector managers, which are our job developers, it's all about education. I think that there's the EEOC ruling really gives another kind of tool in the toolbox to engage employers. And, you don't, as I said, it's a tool in the toolbox. So you talk about this decision relative to the tax credits and relative to the willingness. All of those items working together makes an employer more willing and makes a stronger case for us being able to place individuals into jobs. But this ruling is really transformational, I think, and we just have to be able to communicate it and get the word out.
Great. So just to recap some of the highlights that we heard today from our panelists, which is, jobs alone are not enough to reduce recidivism, but we've learned so much about how to provide employment services so that we can see an impact in risk reduction. And it's all about targeting, as Mindy says, the right person with the right program at the right time. And really excited to see the lessons learned from the MDRC research and what we're learning from these giant employment programs in Chicago and New York City, and eager to share those conversations and continue those conversations in breakout sessions later on today. But I just wanted to turn it back over to you, John, and see if you wanted to close us out.
Sure. Let me get up so I'm not hidden to half the room. So let me acknowledge that there are probably some number of you in the audience who are thinking that some of what you've heard today flies in the face of what your experience has been or what you think you know, right? So there's been a school of thought that says, hey, if you get them a job, they won't commit crimes. You might even be saying, I don't know what they do, but in my program, we can actually reduce recidivism because we can get them jobs. And that may in fact be the case. But what I want you to appreciate is that what we're really trying to do here is push the envelope on the deeper questions with the help of groups like MDRC and CEO and SAFER and others. We're trying to push the envelope on the deeper question of what do we really know about the connection between work and recidivism? And more importantly, how do we know that? Okay? In a broader context, workforce development as a field is under attack. There have been budget proposals put up in Congress that would actually wipe out the Workforce Investment Act, which is the publicly funded workforce development system, which a lot of you guys, I'm sure, get funding from to provide some services. So with that being the context, let me make a plea for us to really think about how we can become much more strategic about the work that we do. I want to talk just quickly about this idea of results, data, and targeting. So results, really thinking about how much we do of what we do, how well we do it, and is anyone better off as a result? So it's a results framework that really focuses on those three simple questions. In order to answer those questions, you got to be much better at data, and you have to have the infrastructure and the staff training to be able to answer that. How much, how well, is anyone better off, okay? In terms of targeting, again, this is something that might conflict with some of your organizational values. I know that as providers, we want to be able to serve everyone who walks in the door. And what we're saying is, in an environment of reduced resources, that for the foreseeable future doesn't look like it's going to grow, we want to be able to have second chance funding opportunities available. We want to be able to have Workforce Investment Act dollars available and other types of publicly funded operating streams for you. We need to get a lot more strategic about who we serve and how we serve. And this notion of targeting those who can benefit the most is something that really deserves a lot of attention. And again, I want to acknowledge that for some organizations, this could be a little problematic and challenging. We want to serve everyone who walks in the door, but we also want to be able to serve those folks who can gain the most. And then lastly, the results and data connection. So using data to answer those three questions is one thing, but also more importantly, I think, is how you influence public policy and how you document your story. Right? I believe that those organizations who are really good at data are at a competitive advantage with others because you can tell and document what you do and the difference that you make. The conversation continues this afternoon. We are having a smaller group session with Cindy, Mindy, and Steve. In Delaware B from 1:45 to 3:15. That sounded like a singing group.
It's the only degree
So
I've got.
from 1:45 to 3:15, we're going to have a smaller group session in Delaware B. I invite you all to come. If you would just join me, please, in giving a hand to our panelists.